The Clark family's journey to the old farmhouse in rural Maine was a silent affair, the car filled with the kind of tense anticipation that one might reserve for a visit to an ailing relative rather than a holiday retreat. As the SUV crunched over the gravel path, the skeletal branches of the bare November trees reached out like the fingers of ghosts, scratching at the fading light of the late afternoon. Eleanor Clark, the matriarch, remembered the house from her childhood, a majestic structure with sprawling fields and a mysterious wood that bordered its lands. It had been 20 years since she last crossed its threshold, driven away by the death of her grandfather and the heavy sorrow that seemed to saturate its walls. Now she returned, compelled by a longing to reconnect with her past, and perhaps to share a piece of it with her husband, James, and their 2 children, Lily and Max. As the house came into view, shrouded in an unsettling fog that rolled in from the east, James muttered under his breath about the foreboding nature of their lodgings. The farmhouse stood defiantly against the backdrop of the encroaching dusk, its windows dark, its paint peeled, and its general disrepair evident even from a distance. They unloaded their bags onto the creaking front porch as the wind began to howl, the sound mingling with the distant crashing of the ocean waves against the rocky shore. The key, left under the mat by a distant cousin who still cared for the property, felt unnaturally cold in Eleanor's hand as she unlocked the door. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the high ceilings, and the once gleaming wooden floors were dulled and scratched. Flicking the switch by the door yielded no results. Power outage, most likely, thought James as he fumbled in his bag for a flashlight. As they ventured further into the house, their footsteps echoed in the empty halls, each room revealing remnants of the past. Faded photographs on the walls, antique furniture draped in white sheets, and a grandfather clock that stood silent, its pendulum still. In the living room, a heavy, old-fashioned book lay on the coffee table, its leather cover cracked and its pages yellowed. Curious, Lily, the younger of the 2 siblings, opened it to find it was a journal, dated back over 100 years ago. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, and as she read aloud, the words seemed to resonate with the whispering wind outside. November 18th, 1894. It is again the time of year when the leaves have fallen and the earth prepares to sleep. But there is no rest for the soil of our land, nor for the souls that have tended it. We have observed the rites, yet I fear it is not enough. There is a stirring beneath the ground, a restless turning as if the earth itself dreams troubled dreams. Let this journal serve as a warning. The harvest must not be forgotten, the old ways must be honored, and the spirits appeased. For when the moon shows its full face, as it will tonight, they will come forth to claim what is theirs. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as she exchanged a worried glance with James. The full moon, indeed, was due to rise that very night. The children sensed their parents' unease and moved closer, their playful banter replaced by an unspoken dread. Deciding it was best to address practical matters first, James suggested they check the fuse box while Eleanor and the children would try to light the fireplace. As they separated to attend to their tasks, the wind's moan grew louder, and somewhere in the depths of the house, a door slammed shut on its own, sealing them in with the secrets of the past. The Clark family had come seeking a peaceful Thanksgiving retreat, a chance to bond and give thanks away from the chaos of their daily lives. Yet, as darkness enveloped the farmhouse and shadows began to play on the walls, it became clear that what they might instead find was a chapter of their family history that was better left unturned. The Clark family, unsettled by the haunting journal entry but driven by a need to keep moving, began the arduous task of setting up their temporary home in the old farmhouse. Eleanor directed the children to gather wood from a pile under the back porch while James investigated the fuse box, hoping to restore power and some semblance of normalcy. The house, however, seemed reluctant to shed its cloak of darkness and mystery. As James navigated his way to the basement, The air grew colder, each step on the creaky stairs echoing through the silent house like a solemn drumbeat. The basement was cluttered with relics of the past, rusted farming tools, broken furniture, and stacks of faded newspapers detailing events long forgotten. The fuse box, when he finally found it behind an old moth-eaten curtain, was in a dismal state, its wires gnawed by time and neglect. After several attempts, the lights flickered and groaned to life, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, as if disturbed by the intrusion. Meanwhile, Eleanor and the children managed to light the fireplace. The crackling fire brought a small comfort. The warmth seemed to stir the house from its slumber, coaxing out sounds and small movements that bordered on the edge of the children's imagination. Shadows seemed to flicker just beyond the reach of the firelight, and the wind whispered through cracks in the window frames, carrying voices that might have been cries or calls. Lily, her curiosity overcoming her unease, returned to the journal. With the flicker of the fire illuminating the pages, she read about the house's original inhabitants, the Harrows, a family steeped in local lore and intertwined with the mysterious traditions of the land. The journal spoke of a harvest feast, a yearly event that was both a celebration and a ritual, meant to appease the spirits of the land. It was clear that these rituals were tied to the survival of the Harrow family and perhaps even the town itself. Max, feeling brave in the glow of the fire, explored the adjoining rooms. In what appeared to have been a study, he discovered a series of portraits, stern faces watching from gilded frames. There was a heaviness in the room, as if each portrait was imbued with a watchful presence. On the desk, a collection of old quills and dried ink bottles lay beside a stack of unopened letters tied with a faded ribbon. It was as though the room had been left abruptly and preserved as a shrine to the past. Dinner preparations began with Eleanor finding an old but sturdy cookware in the kitchen. The kitchen still held the faint aroma of herbs and spices used long ago, mingling now with the mustiness of disuse. As they cleaned and prepared the food, each member of the family felt watched, the sensation of unseen eyes upon them almost tangible. The feeling intensified as the sun set completely, leaving only the fire and sporadic lamplight to hold back the encroaching darkness. James, having done what he could with the electricity, joined his family in the kitchen. They worked together, peeling, chopping, and stirring, trying to focus on the task at hand rather than the eerie atmosphere of the house. As they moved around, they occasionally bumped into one another, apologizing and laughing nervously at their jitters, trying to make light of the situation. However, as they set about cooking the meal, the house seemed to respond. The floorboards creaked continuously, as if footsteps were pacing along with them. The wind's howling seemed to crescendo with their rising unease, and at one point, the whole house shuddered as if in a gust, rattling the windows and doors, a stern reminder of the storm outside, or perhaps something more sinister stirring within. With each passing hour, the family felt the weight of the house's history pressing down upon them. The shadows grew longer, and the flickering lights seemed to hesitate, as if deciding whether to reveal or conceal the secrets of the old Harrow farmhouse. Despite their efforts to keep spirits high, a creeping dread settled over the Clark family as they prepared to sit down for their Thanksgiving meal, surrounded not just by the past, but by the palpable presence of something that refused to be forgotten. As the wind howled against the ancient glass panes, the Clark family gathered in the dining room, each member carrying dishes filled with the fruits of their labor. The table was set with the faded linen and chipped porcelain found in the farmhouse's dusty cabinets, lending an air of antiquity to their meal. Eleanor had placed candles at intervals, their flames casting quivering shadows against the walls and ceiling, creating a dance of light and darkness that mesmerized and unnerved in equal measure. The dining room itself seemed to close in around them, the portraits on the walls peering down with silent, judgmental gazes. James, attempting to dispel the growing unease, raised his glass for a toast. "To new beginnings and old traditions," he declared, his voice slightly tremulous. The family echoed his toast, their voices a mix of genuine cheer and forced bravado. As they began to eat, the sounds of the storm outside grew more furious, as if challenging the warmth and light inside. The wind screamed like a banshee, an eerie, wailing chorus that seemed almost human. Lily, ever the imaginative one, whispered, "It sounds like they're trying to get in." Max shushed her, not wanting to amplify their fears, but he too glanced nervously towards the windows. Midway through the meal, the house's power flickered and then failed entirely, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the flickering candlelight that now seemed too feeble to fend off the encroaching shadows. The sudden darkness caused a collective gasp, and Eleanor fumbled with her phone to provide some additional light. In the dim glow of the smartphone, the shadows appeared to elongate, stretching towards the table as if drawn by the light or perhaps the people it surrounded. James tried to laugh it off. "Just the old wiring," he said, attempting to soothe the children's fears. "I'll check the fuse again after dinner." However, as they resumed eating, trying to ignore the groans of the old house and the storm's cacophony, an unsettling chill swept through the room. It was then that Lily noticed an additional shadow near the end of the table, a shape and form that did not belong. It was not cast by any candle or object, but seemed to originate from within itself, a darker patch of night that chilled the soul. "Mom, do you see that?" Lily's voice quavered as she pointed. The family turned, staring as the shadow seemed to pulse and swell, growing more distinct with each passing second. It was as if the darkness had coalesced into the form of a person, seated at their table as an uninvited guest. The temperature in the room dropped, breaths turning visible in the candlelight. The family sat frozen, not daring to move as the shape appeared to turn towards them, its edges blurring and reshaping, as though it were looking at each of them in turn. Max reached under the table, squeezing his sister's hand in a silent promise of protection. Eleanor, summoning courage she didn't feel, addressed the shadow directly. "Who are you? What do you want?" Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. The shadow did not speak, but the house responded. A low moan traveled through the walls, the floorboards creaked, and somewhere upstairs, a door slammed with force. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the power surged back to life, the overhead light blinding them momentarily. When their eyes adjusted, the shadow was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered, a palpable presence that refused to be ignored. The family sat in stunned silence, unsure of what had just occurred. James finally broke the silence, his voice unsteady. "Let's clear the table. We can talk about this, figure out what it means, but let's not jump to any conclusions." As they cleared the dishes, their movements were hurried, each clatter and clang a defiance against the silence. But the peace of the meal was shattered. The house seemed to have awakened something, or had merely made visible what had always been there, watching from the shadows. The remainder of the evening passed in a haze of anxiety and whispered theories. They checked every lock and shuttered every window, a futile attempt to secure the house from whatever had joined them. As they prepared for bed, the wind continued to assault the house, a reminder that some doors, once opened, are not so easily closed. After the unsettling events at the dinner table, the Clark family found themselves huddled together in the living room, the largest yet seemingly coziest room in the old farmhouse. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to a few glowing embers, casting a soft, eerie glow across the room. None dared to venture alone to fetch more wood from the shadow-laced back porch. Eleanor, trying to maintain a semblance of calm, suggested they distract themselves with stories of their family's past, hoping to reconnect with a happier history of the old home. Each tale seemed to circle back to the strange customs and whispered legends of their ancestors, only serving to heighten the tension rather than soothe it. James, ever the skeptic, attempted to rationalize the evening's occurrences. "It's just an old house settling," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Old houses have drafts and shadows that play tricks on your eyes, especially in a storm." Max and Lily were not convinced. They exchanged uneasy glances, recalling the distinct, ominous presence of the shadow at the table. It was an image neither could shake, and their young minds raced with the possibilities of ghosts and otherworldly entities. As they discussed, the wind outside crescendoed, as if angered by their dismissals. The old windows rattled violently in their frames, and a particularly fierce gust sent a shiver through the house. It was then that the temperature dropped sharply, their breaths visible in the air as puffs of white. A palpable sense of dread settled over the room, heavier than before. Suddenly, the embers in the fireplace flared as if breathed upon, casting a brief, fierce light that threw their exaggerated shadows against the walls. And there it was again, the unexplained shadow, this time not at the table, but standing in the corner of the room, darker than the surrounding darkness, a silent sentinel. Frozen, the family watched as the shadow slowly began to move, its form shifting, elongating. It whispered, a sound like dry leaves dragged across stone, a language they could not understand but felt deep within their bones. "Maybe it wants something from us," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Or maybe it's just the echo of something old, something tied to this place," Eleanor responded, trying to stay rational but feeling the strain. James stood abruptly, his protective instincts overriding his fear. "Enough of this," he said firmly. "We're not going to let some trick of the light scare us away. We're going to find out what this is. With determined strides, he fetched a flashlight from his coat and motioned for Max to join him. "We're going to check the house, every inch. There has to be a logical explanation." Max, eager to prove his courage, nodded and followed his father. Together, they ventured into the darkened hallways, their flashlight beams cutting through the blackness. Each room they entered was cold and deserted, the only sounds their own breathing and the distant relentless storm. Back in the living room, Eleanor and Lily waited anxiously, jumping at every small sound. The shadow had not moved again, but its presence was felt, a weight on the very air. Eleanor pulled Lily close, her eyes scanning the darkness for any change, any sign of what this entity might be. Meanwhile, James and Max's search brought them to the attic. The narrow staircase creaked under their weight as they ascended. The attic was cluttered with old furniture covered in white sheets, looking like ghostly figures in the dim light. They examined each corner, the beams of their flashlights uncovering nothing but thick dust and cobwebs. It was Max who found the small, hidden door in the floor, partially obscured by an old rug. With a mutual look of determination, they opened it, revealing a ladder leading down into darkness. The air that rose from the opening was colder still, filled with the must of decay and the tang of earth. "Should we go down?" Max asked, his voice trembling slightly. James hesitated, his reason warring with his fear. But before he could decide, a sudden violent force shook the house, as if it were in the grip of an angry giant. They heard Eleanor scream from below, her terror a clear call to action. Rushing back downstairs, they found Eleanor and Lily clutching each other, staring at the spot where the shadow had stood. It was gone now, but the room was colder than ever, the chill deep enough to freeze the marrow. "We have to leave," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "Tonight." "No." James nodded, the resolve in his face hard as stone. "Pack what you need. We're leaving." As they hurriedly gathered their belongings, the storm outside seemed to mock their efforts, the wind howling in glee or perhaps in warning. The old house creaked and groaned around them, reluctant to let go of its newest occupants, its secrets unshared, its shadows unexplained. But the Clark family knew only one thing for certain: they could not stay another night. With their belongings hastily thrown into bags, the Clark family prepared to abandon the farmhouse under the cloak of a tumultuous night. However, as they moved toward the door, Lily hesitated, glancing back at the old journal left open on the living-room table. An inexplicable pull urged her to take it with them. Its ancient pages might hold the key to understanding the night's eerie events. She grabbed it, tucking it under her arm as they made their way to the car, the wind howling as if in protest. Once inside the vehicle, the family sat in silence, their breaths fogging up the windows. The engine idled, a low rumble beneath the roar of the storm. James flicked on the headlights, casting long shadows across the yard that seemed to dance mockingly. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor insisted on one last review of the journal, hoping to find anything that might explain or aid them should the shadow follow them from the house. Flipping through the yellowed pages by the dome light, Eleanor found the entries of a different ancestor, a woman named Abigail Harrow, who had chronicled more extensively the peculiar customs and disturbing occurrences tied to the farmhouse. The entries dated back to the late 1800s, describing in more detail the ritual of the harvest feast and its purpose. According to Abigail, the feast wasn't just a celebration of bounty but a necessary tribute to appease what she referred to as the guardians of the land. "The guardians watch over this place, protecting the balance of nature and the spirit world," Eleanor read aloud, her voice steady despite the rising wind outside. "But they require our respect and offerings. Without these, they grow restless, their displeasure manifesting in ways that can turn deadly. The shadows are not just absence of light, they are the essence of the guardians, a glimpse of their form in our world." James listened, skepticism warring with the undeniable reality of their experience. "And what exactly did these offerings consist of?" he asked, tension evident in his voice. Abigail's account was clear. The offerings were typically harvest goods, the best of the crops, and sometimes more personal items imbued with significant familial sentiment. These were to be presented at an altar stone located somewhere on the property, a detail that none of the Clarks had been aware of. "We need to find this altar," Max suddenly piped up, surprising his parents. "Maybe if we do what the journal says, give them what they want, it will stop all this. But what if it doesn't? What if it just makes things worse?" Lily countered, her voice small. Eleanor considered both points, her maternal instinct clashing with the logical desire to flee and never look back. But deep down, she knew Max might be right. Understanding and addressing the root of the haunting might be their only chance to truly escape it. Maybe there is a way to make peace, she suggested, not fully convinced herself. The decision was made to return to the house, but as they drove back up the gravel path, the storm intensified, as though trying to deter them. Arriving back at the dark silhouette of the farmhouse, the family equipped themselves with flashlights and the journal, and ventured back into the storm-lashed night. Guided by Abigail Harrow's detailed descriptions, they found the altar stone in a neglected part of the overgrown garden, half hidden by wild shrubs and covered in moss. It was a large, flat rock with ancient, weathered symbols carved into its surface, symbols that none of them recognized but felt unnervingly familiar. With trembling hands, they placed their offerings: apples from the dinner, a silver locket Eleanor had worn, and a small, handmade toy car that had belonged to Max and Lily's grandfather. Each item was placed with reverence, a silent plea for peace. As the last item touched the stone, the air shifted, the wind dying down as suddenly as it had arisen. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, a sign that perhaps their offering was accepted, or at least acknowledged. Feeling a tentative sense of relief, the family returned to the house to gather the rest of their belongings. They planned to leave at first light, hopeful yet cautious. The shadow did not appear again that night, and while the storm continued to rage outside, inside the farmhouse, there was a sense of uneasy calm. As they settled in for the night, the journal lay open on the living room table, Abigail's final entry underlined by Lily's finger: "Respect the old ways, for they are deep and powerful. And remember, the guardians are not just protecting us from something, they are also protecting something from us." The words echoed in their minds, a solemn reminder of their place in a much larger, older tapestry of history and mystery. The Clark family sat in tense silence as the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the farmhouse's boarded-up windows. They had made it through the night, but the oppressive weight of the house's dark history still lingered, pressing on their hearts and minds. The events of the previous evening, the shadowy presence, the journal's ominous warnings, and the eerie calm that followed their offering, had shaken them to their core. Eleanor, who had taken it upon herself to read further into the journal during the night, was the first to break the silence. "It says here," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that the tribute isn't just a one-time thing. The Harrows believed that the offerings were only a temporary appeasement. If the balance is truly disturbed, more might be required." James turned to her, his exhaustion giving way to irritation. "We already gave what we could, Eleanor. How much more can they possibly want? We need to leave now." Lily, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders, spoke up hesitantly. "But what if leaving isn't enough? What if it follows us?" Her words hung in the air like a specter, and for a moment no one dared to respond. Finally, Eleanor took a deep breath and looked back at the journal. "There's more," she said, flipping to a section she had marked during the night. "Abigail writes about a final tribute, a last resort offering made to truly mend the rift between the living and the guardians. It has to be something of great personal value, something irreplaceable." James groaned and ran a hand through his hair. "This is insane. We're letting an old book dictate what we do. It's just a house, Eleanor. It can't hurt us if we leave." Eleanor shot him a sharp look. "We both know it's not just the house, James. You saw that shadow as clearly as I did. This isn't about belief or reason anymore. This is survival." Max, who had been sitting silently by the window, suddenly stood. "If it's survival, then we need to do what the journal says. I'll give up something." Everyone turned to him in surprise, and Max's determined face faltered for a moment under their scrutiny. "I'll give them this," he said, pulling out an old pocket-knife that had belonged to his late grandfather. "It's the only thing I have that means anything." Eleanor's heart ached at the sight of her son's willingness to sacrifice something so precious. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll all give something," she said firmly. "We're in this together." The family gathered their offerings. Eleanor chose her wedding ring, the band worn smooth by years of love and struggle. James reluctantly offered his father's watch, an heirloom he had always cherished. Lily took out a handmade bracelet she had woven as a child, a keepsake of simpler, happier times. As they carried their items back to the altar stone, the morning light grew dimmer, as though the sun itself was reluctant to shine upon the farmhouse's secrets. The air was unnaturally still, the absence of wind and birdsong creating a suffocating silence. When they reached the altar, they placed their tributes carefully atop the weathered stone. For a moment, nothing happened. The family exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if their actions had been enough. Then, a deep rumble resonated from beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was stirring. The carved symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, a sickly green light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The family backed away instinctively, fear gripping them as the ground around the altar started to crack, small fissures spreading outward. A low, guttural sound emanated from the altar, not quite a voice but something ancient and alive. It was neither a growl nor a roar, but something in between, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The light from the altar intensified, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rumbling ceased. The light flickered once and disappeared, leaving the altar dark and silent once more. The family stood frozen, their breaths ragged in the heavy air. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice trembling. I think it's done." But before they could fully process what had happened, the ground beneath the altar collapsed entirely, revealing a deep, yawning pit. From its depths rose a chilling wind that carried whispers in an ancient language, incomprehensible but filled with malice. The family stumbled back as something began to emerge, a formless mass of shadows, twisting and writhing like smoke but with a tangible, menacing presence. The whispers grew louder, echoing all around them. It became clear that their tribute had not been enough. The guardians, or whatever they were, had not been satisfied. Their presence demanded more. James grabbed Max and Lily by their arms and pulled them back toward the house, shouting at Eleanor to follow. They ran, the wind howling behind them, carrying the whispers that seemed to burrow into their minds. The house, once a place of refuge, now seemed like a prison as they slammed the door shut and barricaded it with whatever furniture they could find. Inside, the air was thick with fear and despair. Eleanor frantically flipped through the journal, searching for some clue, some solution they might have missed. "There has to be something else," she cried. "Some way to stop this." Lily, huddled with Max in a corner, whispered, "What if they don't want things? What if they want us?" Her words sent a shiver through everyone. Eleanor stopped flipping pages, her hands trembling as she realized that Lily might be right. Abigail's warnings had always emphasized the balance, the connection between the living and the spirits. Perhaps the offerings had only been a way to delay the inevitable. Before they could discuss further, the whispers outside grew into a deafening roar. The shadows pressed against the windows and doors, seeping through the cracks like living darkness. The house groaned under the pressure, the walls bowing as though about to collapse. Desperation overtook them. James shouted, "We have to leave now. Staying here will kill us." But Eleanor wasn't so sure anymore. Something deeper was at play, something they still didn't fully understand. As the shadows closed in, she clutched the journal tightly, the words of their ancestor Abigail echoing in her mind. The Guardians are not just protecting us from something, they are also protecting something from us. What had the Guardians been protecting? And had the Clarks accidentally unleashed it by disturbing the balance? Eleanor's heart sank as she realized they might have already crossed a line that could not be undone. The family's survival depended on finding the answer, if there even was one. The Clark family huddled together in the farmhouse's dim living room, the journal clutched tightly in Eleanor's trembling hands. Outside, the storm reached a fever pitch, the shadows clawing at the windows and doors, their inky forms stretching and curling like sentient smoke. The whispers had turned into a guttural chorus, rising and falling in waves that seemed to echo through the very walls of the house. Eleanor flipped through the journal frantically, the fragile pages threatening to tear under her fingers. Abigail Harrow's words blurred in her vision as the tension mounted. There had to be a way to end this, a way to escape the wrath of the Guardians. "Mom," Max whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony outside. "What if they don't want us to leave? What if this is why the house was abandoned?" Eleanor paused, the journal's weight in her hands suddenly feeling unbearable. Her son's words struck a chord deep within her. The Guardians didn't just demand tribute, they enforced their dominion over the land and those tied to it. This wasn't about a single night's appeasement, it was about the Clark family's intrusion into a sacred, cursed space that had rejected them. "We don't have a choice," James said, pacing the room. His voice was sharp with fear. "We have to leave. If we stay here, whatever's out there will get in." Lily, huddled with Max, looked up at her father. "But what if they follow us? What if it's not the house, but us they're angry with?" Eleanor's grip on the journal tightened as she stood. "It's both," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "The house, the land, us, everything is connected. Abigail's writings make it clear. This isn't just a haunting, it's a warning, a curse tied to the disrespect of the old ways." "But there's more." James turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, more?" Eleanor flipped to the final entry, where Abigail had scrawled a cryptic, hurried warning. She read aloud, "When the Guardians rise, they are not the only force awakened. Beneath their shadow lies the true danger. The altar marks the gate. If the balance is tipped too far, the gate may open." "The gate," Lily whispered, clutching Max's hand. Eleanor nodded grimly. "The altar isn't just a place for offerings. It's a seal. If the Guardians are disturbed, they keep something worse at bay." A deafening crack resounded outside, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The family jumped as the shadows began to seep through the gaps in the boarded-up windows, their tendrils moving with deliberate malice. The whispers turned to guttural growls, and the house groaned as if under immense pressure. "We have to go," James shouted, grabbing the flashlight. "Now." The family rushed toward the door, Eleanor clutching the journal as though it were a lifeline. As James flung the door open, a blast of icy wind almost knocked them off their feet. Outside, the landscape had changed. What had been familiar fields and trees now seemed twisted, warped by the encroaching darkness. The altar stone in the distance glowed faintly, the cracks in its surface pulsing with an ominous green light. "There's no way out," Lily whimpered, staring into the storm of shadows that surrounded them. "There has to be," James insisted, pulling them forward. "We'll get to the car and—" He stopped mid-sentence as the ground beneath the altar began to quake. The fissures around the stone widened, and from the earth erupted a column of shadow, swirling upward like a living tornado. Within its depths, a shape began to form, something vast and incomprehensible, with twisting limbs and glowing, inhuman eyes. The air was filled with an unearthly roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. Eleanor's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The gate had been opened. "The altar!" she shouted over the storm. "We have to close it." James turned to her, his face pale. How do we close something like that?" Eleanor flipped through the journal, the pages whipping in the wind. "Abigail wrote about it. It requires a final act of sacrifice. Something deeply personal, something that means everything." "We already gave everything we could," James shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. Eleanor shook her head, her voice breaking. "Not everything." The family stared at her, the realization dawning. The sacrifice had to be more than objects. It had to be life itself. "No," James said firmly, stepping in front of her. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "The Guardians want balance. They need to know we respect their power, their place. This is the only way." Before anyone could stop her, Eleanor broke away from the group and ran toward the altar. The wind whipped at her hair and clothes, and the shadows seemed to part before her, as if recognizing her intent. She reached the altar, standing before the glowing fissure, the monstrous form above her writhing and roaring. "Take this," she whispered, placing the journal on the altar. "Take our stories, our history, our respect. Take it all, but leave my family." The glowing fissure pulsed violently, the air around her crackling with energy. The monstrous shadow loomed closer, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever came next. Suddenly, the light from the altar flared, blinding and pure. The ground beneath her shook violently, and the shadow roared in defiance. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light vanished, and silence fell. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was lying on the cold ground, the altar stone intact and the fissures gone. The storm had abated, the sky clear and still. The shadows, the whispers, the oppressive weight of the Guardians, all of it had disappeared. Her family rushed to her side, tears streaming down their faces. James pulled her into his arms, his voice breaking. "You're okay. You're okay." They sat together in the quiet dawn, the farmhouse looming behind them, silent and foreboding. The house had returned to its slumber, the curse seemingly lifted, for now. As they drove away, leaving the farmhouse and its dark history behind, Eleanor glanced back one last time. The house stood solemn and still, its secrets buried once more. The journal, and the sacrifices of the Harrows and the Clarks, had returned the balance to the land. But deep in her heart, Elinor knew the truth. The balance was delicate, and the guardians never forgot.